and depending on the remarks, I'll be asking some questions, some leading questions. In 19th century India, many translators, a large number of Indian translators, many translators translated numerous texts from European languages into their respective mother tongues. And it was Gandhi, Premchand, and several others asked, rather requested Indian translators to translate Western texts into their mother tongue in order to enrich these languages. And they did the job as vigorously as we are translating Indian texts into English and other European languages these days. However, the history of translation in India, especially translating Indian texts for the world, goes back to ancient times. And I'm reminded of a story about one such fascinating translation. It so happened that in the 6th century AD, the king of Persia called Khusro heard that there lies a land called India, whatever the name was back then, and one may find a magical potion, magical herb Sanjeevani Booty from there, which is a source of immortality. So in the pursuit of that herb, that magical potion, he sent his physician, Bourgeois, to India. And after exploring the entire country, the physician was on the verge of returning empty-handed. And then suddenly he chanced upon an Indian sage who told him, what you are looking for is not a magical herb, but a book. And that book is full of so much knowledge that it may bring immortality. उन्होंने कहा, सेज ने कहा कि जो मूर्ख व्यक्ति होता है वो मृत प्राय होता है और ज्ञान रूपी संजीवनी को पीकर वो जीवित हो उठता है. And the text was Panchtantra. So in the 6th century AD, the Iranian physician took a copy of Panchtantra to Iran, where it was translated for the first time in Pahlavi. And that copy, unfortunately, is lost. And in the 8th century AD, roughly in the 9th century AD, that copy was translated into Arabic as Kalila and Dimne. And incidentally, in 2016, when Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi went to Iran, he released a manuscript copy of Kalila and Dimne to commemorate ancient ties between Iran and India. And then from Arabic, it was translated into Hebrew, from Hebrew into Greek, from Greek into Latin, from Latin into Italian, and from Italian into English in 1570 by Sir Thomas North, as early as 1570. And since then, the frame narrative, the technique that Vishnu Sharma employs in Panchtantra, inspired Boccaccio, the Italian storyteller, English writer Chaucer, and frame narrative, in my opinion, is India's contribution to the world. And the reason why I shared this anecdote with the audience is that it reflects on two things: that how we have a rich history of translation, and two, how translation since ancient times has played an instrumental role in bridging the gap between India and the world. I won't continue speaking, or else the question, who will moderate the moderator, may crop up before the audience. So I'll invite my celebrated panelists, distinguished panelists, one by one to comment on this topic, and then we may take some questions. So I'll begin by inviting, that's the order that I was given, the eminent poet, prolific poet, literary critic and curator, Ranjit Haskote. I'll request him to share his views on this topic. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lalit. And it's marvelous that we're discussing this very important question. And the way in which you talked about how the Panchatantra then becomes the Dastan Kalideva Dimne, and in another recension, it becomes the Anvari Suheli, and then it continues, as you pointed out, across the Maghreb and goes into Europe. Today, I think the situation is somewhat different. So I'm just going to telegraph 3 points, two or three points that I'd like to make. One of them is this. If you think even about the title of our session, for some reason, we seem very eager to continuously perform for the world, imagining that we are somehow insular here. My real concern as a writer and a translator today is that we need to translate India for India in the first place. In linguistic terms, we are a continent, practically in other terms too. But I think the real crisis here is that, this is a bee in my bonnet, I think linguistic states were a terrible idea. They have entrenched us all in very spurious notions of linguistic and regional identities, which need to be somehow foolishly asserted at the expense of other linguistic and regional possibilities. I think our primary concern should be that we take all of our languages and translate them across our regional borders here, rather than continuously try to present our work to some kind of imagined global audience. So that's the first point I'd make. We need a serious shift of focus here, which in itself also picks up on a first half of the 20th century history of how translation used to be and how vibrant it was in South Asia. The second point I'd like to make is that, for good or ill, we tend to be obsessed with the idea of translating from the Desha Bhashas into English for what we imagine to be a global audience. However this is to be done, and we can discuss it, we have people who've addressed these questions in practical terms on the panel. I think we are not looking at, for instance, translation into Spanish or into Portuguese. I'm thinking here of Brazil, for instance. There are entire continents. We are not thinking of translation into the major languages of the African continent. So thinking about translating from Indian languages to the world is political for multiple reasons. This is an invitation to us to actually step outside of our Anglo-American obsessions and to think about these other major world languages where there are readers for our literatures. And this calls for a refocusing of what I regret to say is still an extremely colonized frame of mind that we suffer from. Essentially, these would be my points.
That's a very valid point that you have made. Thank you for making this wonderful point, that is translating India for India. And in some ways, I feel, of course, I agree with you. In fact, I grew up in a society where translation meant translating something into English, translate into English, nothing else. That was the perception. But at the same time, I also feel that since now we have started treating English almost as an Indian language, so when we translate Indian text into English, we in a way are participating in the process of decolonizing syllabus also. I teach at Delhi University and I teach 6 acres and a third in English translation. Chamanad Gunda, written by Fakir Mohan Senapati, the Oriya novelist Fakir Mohan Senapati. And it could become possible only after Professor Jatin Kumar Nayak and others translated that Oriya novel into English. And therefore, I do feel that if we translate more and more Indian texts into English, and that should be seen as an extension of the point that you make, translating India for India, we will be able to decolonize the Eurocentric approach that we still follow in Indian universities. So our distinguished panelists will be able to respond more on that, this topic. And next we have Rajesh Singh, an acclaimed journalist and writer. So we look forward to his views on this topic.
Thank you. Now, before I have my 2 bit of opinion on the translation, whether one must concentrate on English or the other languages, as Ranjit has said. But before I do that, why do we translate? There are 2 basic reasons for translation. One is hello. Yeah. So the one reason why we translate is the literary part. How well has the translation reflected the original? Has it got the nuances? Has it captured the nuances, etc., etc.? The other is the communicative part. Now, the communicative part is basically what has been spoken about so far. If I don't know a language and I want to read something that is written in that language by its writers, then I need to pick up a language that I understand. Now, most of the time, since we have so many languages here, now and somebody who understands Hindi will naturally look around to a translation in Hindi of maybe a classic by a Tamil writer or an Odia writer or anybody. Similarly, somebody else speaking another language will look for, but that will become very, very difficult. I suppose that is one reason why we are talking about English translations, in the sense that Hindi, Indian language books or literature translated into English, for example, had those translations in English not been available, I would not have been familiar with either, uh, you know, Sitakant Mahapatra, or Gopinath Mohanty. All of these people I became familiar because of the English translations. But I'll just say one thing. Sometimes we might know two languages, and there will be, let's say I know Hindi, I read Hindi, I speak Hindi, and also English. Now if I suddenly see a translation uh, of a well-known Hindi book in English, I can of course read that, but as an individual I would prefer reading it in the original language because I know the original language. And then possibly I will read it in English. But I always felt, from whatever little that I have read so far, as that translation is a good means to communicate with various people in various languages and establish a link. But as far as the literary nuances are concerned, I would still feel that if I know a particular language, and if there is something written in that language and I understand it, I must therefore make that as a priority. We can discuss these things as we go along. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for making this wonderful point, and then we will reflect on it further in the second round. Now, I would like to invite Rakshanda Jalil, a celebrated translator and literary historian. Welcome.
Thank you, Lalit. Let me very briefly share my journey over the past 30 odd years and the lessons I have drawn from it. I started as a translator quite by chance, an avuncular editor of the Sahitya Academy, produced short stories by Bimchi, with absolutely no experience of translation. Agreed to do it, and subsequently it was like somebody who tasted blood, जिसको कहते हैं खून मुंह को लग गया. And but for very many years, I was perfectly content to think my job, the brief I had given myself as a translator, was simply to translate it and not worry too much about the context. In the past 30 odd years, I sort of ambled along happily, picking and choosing whatever caught my fancy. Could be a Panishwar Nath Renu, it could be a Rashid Ahmad Siddiqui, it could be a Shahryar, it could be whatever I thought appealed to me. During this time, I managed to also, in my middle age, squeeze in a PhD, and that was on a literary movement, the progressive writers movement, which required a fair amount of reading and therefore, by extension, translating from Urdu into English. But what I learned in all of this, and which I now apply to the task of translation, is the importance that I increasingly want to give to contexts. So if I were to look back on these 30 years from 1992, when I first published that one short story called Mandir Masjid for the Sahitya Academy, to now, I look back on this as a journey from text to context. While the text continues to be very, very important for me, I feel increasingly that the context also needs elaboration, elaboration that the text itself has no space for. So you can't sort of burden a text with too much stuff that is not meant to carry. But what you can do is write a long introductory essay, and something that I now increasingly do, about which some people like it and some don't. I increasingly use footnotes, and I must say relentless footnotes. And this, I think, sometimes is important because there is such a thing as a literary sensibility, a literary sensitivity, which you're not always able to, because the translation from one language into another, especially languages, let's say, as disparate as Urdu, or for that matter, Hindi and English, do not permit. So I increasingly find that I still need to give some context to the reader, but my brief as a translator does not permit me, but I do want to add that. And I no longer see that as a value addition, but I do see that as an integral part of translation, this business of context. So footnotes are a good way of doing it. Glossary has always been there. But Ranjit, I liked what you had to say about the early translations and how we seem to think that we are, this whole business of translations in India being English-centric. Also, the years that I started translating in the mid 90s, and was a time when translators before me, Jayaratan and others, who'd done amazing work actually, were saying things like flat unleavened bread for roti, right? And they were saying it in the body of the text, or they were saying knitted cot for charpai, or some nonsense like that, or they were using generic terms like aunt or uncle, aunt so and so and uncle so and so. Now, in our Indian languages, and I'm sure it's there across the languages, we have specific terms for mother's older sister and father's older brother, and so on and so forth. So I don't see why we should confine ourselves to uncle or aunt, or why we should say clarified butter for ghee. The generation before mine was doing that. I think apart from this journey of text to context, I'm also able to see a growing confidence in the breed of translators that we have. Yes, it remains an English-centric exercise by and large. Maybe somewhere publishing has something to do with that. If only more vernacular publishers were willing to translate world literatures into the local languages, maybe that would be a way forward. But because most translators aspire to get published in English, maybe that could be a reason why it remains so English-centric. Having said that, I'm happy to see a confidence in translators all around me who are willing to use words more naturally into English, not in an artificial or cosmetic sense, but words that slip in very naturally, like array. Array, where are you going? Array doesn't require a translation, It's okay. We'll figure it out. The readers will figure it out. So that confidence, that self-assurance, I think is good to see. And one would be happy to see more of that.
Thank you so much that you talked about striking a delicate balance between text and context, a balance which came in literary theory, in literary studies in the 1980s when New Historicism, a movement, became popular. And in translation, of course, introduction, a rich introduction illustrates the text and the reader gets to know about the context. And the second thing that you beautifully pointed out is about retaining Indian words. And I think that also has to do with the ways in which Hindi and other Indian languages are also expanding their vocabulary. Each year, we witness when Oxford English Dictionary expands its words, many Indian words are included. For instance, now a word such as puja. Puja is an English word now. It's a part of Oxford English Dictionary. Now we do not have to say we are going to worship someone. We simply say we are going to do puja. Tempo, parby, tube light, auntie, all these words earlier were not a part of Oxford English Dictionary. And this is how Hindi and other Indian languages are also being incorporated into English. And then Indian English has also registered itself strongly. It has been given a distinctive identity now. Thank you so much. But again, this question will come up. I'll ask the panelists once the first round is over. What's the way forward? How Vaishali Mathur, who is a publisher of Indian languages at Penguin. Welcome, ma'am. We look forward.
Thank you, Lalit. Good afternoon, everyone. I must say that I'm really happy that this panel got delayed because I was going to miss it because my flight was supposed to land at 12. And I really wanted to be a part of this because I have been working on translations for the past more than 15 years now. So I have my views from the other side of this translating India to the world, and world to India is where I'm coming from now. Because I look after a fair bit of translations in English from Indian languages to English, and I also look after the Hindi and the other languages publishing at Penguin Random House India. So I get to actually interact with a lot of work that happens in translation. So there are a lot of things that you, Rakshanda ji, you've spoken about, Ranjit, you've spoken about, and Rajesh ji, of course, that make a lot of sense, and I feel like I'm in the privileged position where I get to, deal with all these things at the same time as a publisher. One of the most interesting things that we have started doing is that since I started publishing Indian languages, I can see how culturally different our language texts can be, and then putting them and translating them in the English language, how interesting and how deep it can get. For instance, when you're talking about unleavened bread and all, I completely agree, and it was so common that it was so okay to say these things. And I've often seen that translations in English do sound like translations, and those translations get awards and people talk about them and they are critically acclaimed, but they sound like translations. Increasingly, what we have been doing at Penguin is to have translations which are more seamlessly going from one language to the other. So, Ranjit, to your point, I just wanted to say that recently we acquired the rights for Cobalt Blue. So we've done Cobalt Blue. If everyone knows, it's a much critically acclaimed text in Marathi. And it is also out as a Netflix series, but that's besides the point. But so this book is in Marathi and it got translated into English. And what we have done now is that we are doing a Hindi translation of the book, but we've got somebody who is translating from Hindi directly to Marathi, because all of us strongly felt that the syntax, the language, the cultural context are directly better translated from Marathi to Hindi. So I feel that we are in this very, very interesting position where we are exploring a lot more. And if I can say anything to you all, is that we are looking at doing so much exciting work. This has encouraged us to look at other languages and see whether we really need to use English in between. And this is not for thinking that it's a colonial language or any of that, but simply just to see whether we can achieve that, seamlessness, and whether we can have as little of that lost in translation as possible. So I feel that we are at the cusp of something very exciting happening between languages, and I would like to talk more about it as we go along. Thank you.
So thank you so much. We got to hear the views of an insider who is into publishing industry, who has seen the whole story of translation from inside. And I'm happy that you pointed it out, that how it is easier to translate a Marathi text into Hindi than to do it into English. Of course, many translators do feel that it's easier to translate an Indian text into another Indian language, from one Indian language to another, because you can retain the idiomatic vigor in that way. But after all, what's the way forward? I mean, what's the message, as I asked earlier, can we give to younger translators? And what are the things that one should take into account? I think, sir, you wanted to say something, you wanted to add.
Building off of everything that we've put into play just now, I want to dwell a little on this idea of context that Rakshanda brought out, because I'll also go back to 1992, which is when my first book the first translation that I did appeared as a book. It was, as it happens, it was Marathi. I translate from several languages. This was Vasant Abaji Dahake's Yoga Bhrashta. It's a collection of poetry from the early 1970s, which I rendered as a terrorist of the spirit. And speaking anecdotally, on the whole, we got rather nice reviews. There was one review which said, and I quote, because the sentence has branded itself into my mind, I did it with a co-translator. So the reviewer says, in their haste to make Vasant Abaji Dahake sound modern, Haskote and Kulkarni put Allen Ginsberg's words in his mouth. Now, the truth is that Vasant Dahake was perfectly at home with the poetry of the beats, and his original Marathi poem has an Allen Ginsberg line, which is translated into Marathi. So I want to complicate this question of translation a little in two ways. One is, too often there's an assumption that the source, by the way, I dislike this military metaphor, source language and target language, as if you were shooting something. So the idea is that the source language is somehow trapped in a kind of time warp, in some vacuum of its own. So this reviewer thought it was bizarre that a Marathi poet writing in the late 60s and early 70s should have anything to do with the beat poets. It's actually a highly patronizing view. Suggests that there's a complete lack of awareness of the living contemporary life world in each one of these literatures. So when I think about the term bhasha tends to lead us into that. But the fact is that these are all languages and literatures that are acting themselves out in a space that's completely contemporary. And it's an attentiveness to this that I would say should be the focus of the translator. Somewhere in shuttling between text and context and never losing track of the idea that you're not doing the original language a favor. You know, translation is not an act of being a patron to something that's lost or something that's marginal. I think, if anything, what I've learned in these several decades of being a translator is humility. You know, you're always an apprentice to the original text. You also have to realize that texts are vulnerable. They're vulnerable to what happens in transit, to transition. You're presenting them to a new readership. So it's an ethical attentiveness that you have to have, apart from everything else that you need in terms of literary accomplishment, linguistic competence, and so on and so forth.
Thank you so much. One thing I entirely agree with you, and that is shooting at source language, target language, using all the jargon in translation. And I think do believe that the praxis of translation should be kept separate from the theory, high jargon, because good theorists, translation theorists may not be good translators. So we should ask translators to speak about translation, because theory at times kills the joys of translation. And whenever we teach our students at the university source language, target language, we bore them to death. Since time is running out, I would like to request all the panelists to give a quick word, beginning with Rakshanda, Jalii.
Ranjit, your reference to Ginsberg reminds me of something which maybe might be a nice way to wrap up this conversation. I was translating Shahryar, and there was one line from Urdu that said, "Mere uske beech mein lambi raatein padti hoon." So the simplest thing in the world is to say, between her and me lie long nights. I'm not sure why, but the idea and the word just popped into my head, and instead of long nights, I said endless nights. Some of you might remember this is the name of a novel by Agatha Christie. Now, what has Agatha Christie, detective fiction, murder mystery, got to do with Shahryar? Nothing. But when you are sitting and translating, your mind is amazingly open at that idea, while you're doing a very, very close reading of the text in front of you. More close than you would as a general lay, casual reader. You're being very attentive. But somewhere your mind is open to everything you have read. It's like, it's an incredible feeling, you know. At that instant, ideas come to you. And I don't know how this novel that I must have read years ago just made perfect sense. And I chose to say, between her and me lay endless nights. Why? Because before that, there was a sense of darkness, close to evil, that was being evoked in the lines before that. And somewhere in my mind was this memory of this novel that I'd read, which is actually about darkness, about a young couple that is incredibly evil in some way, you know? So this is subjective, but then translation is subjective. Yes, there are losses, but the gains are enormous. The translation tries to be, a good translation tries to be as faithful as possible, also felicitous and all the rest of it, readable and so on. But I must say there is an element of subjectivity. And I often like to take along a very short poem for these workshops that I sometimes do. And it's so interesting to see how a class of 15, 20 young people will translate it 15, 20 different ways. You would have thought 4-line poem, how many permutations, combinations can they have? But it's endless.
It's so true that translation is a highly subjective act. And that is why one classic is translated by 10 different translators, 20 different translators. We never cease to translate them. And now we'll have one quick word from Rajesh Singh ji and then Vaishali ji.
Rakshanda spoke about the interplay of words, endless and long. Now, even if you had used long, it would not have been totally wrong, but endless, of course. But just imagine if I am a translator from some other language into English, and I'm basically an English writer. Okay, so what do I do? I'm so seeped into this language that I forget that I am translating somebody whose sensitivities are very different from that of an English language writer. Now, I'll just give you an example and wind up. Often we find in English novels, the phrase, if somebody says, "Oh, your suit is not very clean," the guy says that it's seen better days. Common thing, you know. Now just imagine आप उसको आप हिंदी में translate कीजिए, ये अच्छे दिन भी इसने देखे हैं. What sense does it make? Right? So therefore, हाँ, ये अच्छे दिन भी इसने देखे हैं. Now it simply, now if you had to translate, so therefore translation is not just, you have to understand the original, and the best translation that everyone has said just now are the ones where the sensitivities, the nuances of the original have been captured the best. Thank you.
I think I'm at the receiving end of all translations because I edit translations. So, whatever people might say that it is subjective, for me, that makes the difference between a good translation and a bad translation. That subjectiveness that we have. I was coming on the flight and editing a text, and English they had written the early word catches the worm. So you can imagine कि हिंदी में क्या लिखा गया था उसमें. There was a translation which was literal, which said that जैसे एक चिड़िया को कीड़ा मिल जाता है, वैसे जो पहले जाता था उसको मिल जाता था, first come first serve basis. So it's just I feel that it is important that we can do several translations, but it is also important to work on ruh of a translation. And I'm saying ruh because we recently have translated Manav Kaul, who's a Kashmiri actor, his ruh from Hindi to English. And we didn't have like a very structured translation. The translation was, by any standards, brilliant. But what was there was that it followed the rhythm of the book. It had words where there were words in Hindi. It had similar words. And it was so beautiful to not touch it so much and to leave it the way it was. And sort of work around it and carve around it so that it reads in a flow, but catches the stream of consciousness of the novel that is there. So I think that whatever you do, I think we should not ruin a translation. And all of us know the difference between a good translation and a bad translation. And I get a lot of people who say, I know Hindi, I know English, and I can translate the text for you. And believe me, they don't. 90% of the people don't know how to translate text. So translation can be as simple as you think it is, but it's as difficult when you sit down and you actually start doing it. So I just wanted to put that across.
Thank you so much. A Hindi equivalent to the proverb that you just mentioned could be "Jo sovat hai so khovat hai, jo jagat hai so pavat hai." Oh, you actually did that. Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, we have some questions from the audience. Okay, I'll come to that. We can have some quick questions. So, of course, as all of you pointed out, that perspective matters a lot in translation. No wonder I am reminded of this French novelist, Marcel Proust. His novel, psychological novel, was translated into English by a celebrated translator first as Remembrance of the Things Past. But a more recent translation titles the novel as In the Search of Lost Time. So now there is a focus on loss. Earlier there was a focus on past. So this is how translators also vary in their opinion. Thank you so much. But we may take some questions quickly. Can we take some questions quickly? Yes, sir. You had a question to ask?
Hello. Check, check. Yeah. I have been listening to this interesting conversation. So I am really interested. Like you, all of you must have read books that are translation of Sanskrit text, right? And Sanskrit as a language is quite different. Like all of us are Indian, must be exposed to Sanskrit to certain degrees in our childhood or any time whatsoever. So Sanskrit as a language is quite different. Like the depth that it gives you, especially if I have to highlight the spiritual depth that it gives you, it's mostly not exactly present in other languages, especially the Western ones. In my observation, I have not really traveled around the world and been exposed to all the kinds of languages. Maybe hieroglyphics have that kind of a depth, but we haven't really cracked understanding them. So I'll be a little short, as in if I keep on talking, we don't have really time. So just highlight about Sanskrit translation and stuff about that, like how you look at it and how good or bad it is, how Eastern people or how Western thinkers translate it, something like this. Elaborate.
Yes, so the gentleman's question is basically about distortion of Sanskrit text into English.
What was the? I mean, I actually do translate from Sanskrit, but I wasn't sure what your question was.
How texts are distorted in Sanskrit, the spiritual side is retained or not?
Okay, very simple answer. Do you know any Sanskrit? Okay, fabulous. So what you should probably also point out is that there is a vast worldly Laukika literature in Sanskrit. The tragedy of Sanskrit is that it is over identified with what is ultimately a very small section, which only comes from one stratum of the rich history of that language. Yeah, what is not often translated is this huge secular literature, which was written in Sanskrit and was written in Sanskrit all the way up to the late 18th, early 19th century. So when we're speaking about Sanskrit, we actually should work to dispel many of the myths around it. One, that it faded into oblivion. It did not. It remained a vibrant language, often patronized by Mughals, Lodhis, and other rulers in the Gangetic Plain. So that's very important. Speaking of Penguin, A.N.D. Haksar's translations of this Laukika Sahitya, that is something that readers should be invited to read. And of course, your point about how Sanskrit is deeper than most languages, all languages have great depth. Yeah, and I think we should be very cautious about issuing universal notions about languages. It usually helps to have some humility about every language, because every language is an articulation of depth and vulnerability and beauty.
Let certain things get lost also, it's all right. We don't have to lament. So thank you so much once again. Whosoever stands between you and your food may be denounced as your enemy. So we won't stand. We won't do that. Thank you so much. I want to thank once again the audience as well as the distinguished panelists. And I feel lucky to be moderating this session. Thank
I
you
would
so much.
request all of you to please be there. On behalf of Kalinga Literary Festival team, I would request our moderator, Lalit Kumar, to please felicitate our dignitaries. A huge round of applause for our dignitaries. Sure, sir. We will look forward to it. Thank you so much, dignitaries, for giving your precious time. I would now request the speakers to please move for the lunch. Then we will again meet up in the same hall at 2:30 p.m. for our next session, Crimson Spring.